Sayadaw will explain that observing closely, concentratedly on the object is called Jhana. Before Sayadaw explain about Jhana, Sayadaw will first explain what was left to be explained yesterday. Yesterday, Sayadaw said that the mind that lacks Satipatthana practice is tender and weak. As it has avijja, not knowing correctly, knowing wrongly, and also craving on desirable objects, tanha. Based on these two things, avijja and tanha, ignorance and craving, the mind is tender, weak. If one lacks Satipatthana practice. Lacking Satipatthana practice, the mind is tender, weak, and it is overwhelmed by things that are stronger. As the mind is immature, tender and weak, it cannot withstand adverse states. It lacks the stamina, the resistance, so that it cannot repel the opposite states. So it is very important to have resistance. And Sayadaw compare it to the physical body. When the physical body is tender and weak, one should nourish the physical body with essential vitamins. When the physical body is fed with spiritual vitamins, the nutrition from the vitamins will pervade in the body, and it will bring strength. It will bring physical strength and physical stamina. There will be paṇḍitā rūpa. There will be fresh, new, good materiality arising that is generated by the nutrition and vitamins. In the same way, when the mind is immature, weak and tender, one should nourish one's mind with Dhammoja, spiritual nutriments, spiritual vitamins. Having developed the spiritual vitamins, the Dhamma uplifts the person who practices systematically. Practicing the Dhamma systematically, one will develop oja, spiritual nutriments that are high in potency, that are high in power. Pala is called power. And teja, it will also have affective potency. Just as if one does not take nutrition in time, the physical body will be weak and it will not be healthy. Taking nutrition, one will build up materiality that are fresh and new. So in the same way, one needs to take spiritual nutrition. If one does not take spiritual nutrition in time, the mind will not develop. The mind will not be developed. It will not be cultured. It will not be mature. And thus, the mind will be weak, tender, immature. And when one comes across desirable objects, greed arises. When undesirable objects arise, there will be hatred, aversion. Weak, tender, immature mind is very quick to respond, and the person easily love and hate. So, when the mind is easy to respond, it shows that the mind is weak, tender, immature. A life that has immature mind, weak, tender mind, his or her life will be incomplete. So, when the mind has deficiency, when the mind is deficient of spiritual vitamins, the mind will be tender and weak. So it shows that one has not developed, one has not cultivated the necessary mental strength that should be cultivated. And Sayadaw will continue to explain today. If one does not know the benefits of physical health, one will not value one's health. Rather than choosing suitable food to eat, one takes unsuitable food, and one can end up having problems connecting with the harmful food. So in the same way, one should control oneself so that one will not meet harm. So Buddha used 4 words. The first one is abhavita kaya. The second, abhavita sila. The third, abhavita citta. And the fourth, abhavita panya. The first one, abhavita kaya, means not developing bodily conduct. If one does not have restraint of one's senses, not controlling them, not having any restraint of one's senses, looking at whatever things one wants to look, not controlling the eyes, not controlling the eye's faculty, listening whatever one wants to hear, smelling good fragrance, smelling whatever one wants to smell, eating whatever one wants to eat, touching whatever one wants to touch. In this way, if one does not have any restraint of one's senses, it will be abhavita kaya. It is very important to have restraint. One should not be looking at things one wants. One should not leave one's eye faculty uncontrolled. There should be indriya samvara. One should have restraint of one's senses. In order to have restraint of one's senses, one should be mindful of every arising object. One should have protection of mindfulness. One should have mindfulness as protection by being mindful of every arising object. Having mindfulness of every arising object, one will be developing sati and samadhi, mindfulness and concentration, and thus there will be indriya samvara. There will be restraint of one's senses. If one is looking without any restraint of eye faculty, eye sense, when one sees pleasant sights, there will be greed, and if one sees undesirable things, there will be anger, hatred, aversion. So seeing things, looking at things without any restraint, when one sees it is a woman, it is a man, then there can be greed. So one can have greed, thinking that it is a man, it is a woman, it is a beautiful woman, it is a handsome man, and so on. Things do not stop here. One goes into detail in looking, seeing the features, how beautiful she is, how handsome he is, and thus greed will grow in greater degree. Seeing into details, there will be greater degree of greed. And when one comes across undesirable objects, there will be hatred, anger, aversion. When one goes into detail, seeing the most hateful aspect of other person, there will be greater degree of anger, hatred, delusion. So seeing in detail the way the other person talks, the way the other person behaves, more greed, more anger, more aversion arises. And also there can be other defilements such as wanting to take other people's belongings by force, having aversion, hatred, grudge, and one will be thinking about these things without any control. There can also be delusion, being dim and vague, and when there is lack of mindfulness, the mind will be distracted. The mind will not be calm and collected, but instead it will be distracted, and thus one will not know the true nature. One will not know completely the true nature, and thus there will be more delusion. It is called Vibanda Citta. The mind is confused, deluded, without any control. When this happens, it will be Pakatendriya. As the mind is uncontrolled, then it will be totally a mess. So if there is no Indriya Samvara, if there is no restraint of the senses, then all these defilements will arise. So when these defilements become extreme, it will be overwhelming, and it will also lead to Abhavita Sila, as the one does not have any control of one's physical and verbal behavior. And thus, there will be abhavita sila. One will be breaking the precepts. There will be abhavita citta, as the mind is uncontrolled. And there will also be abhavita panya, one will not be developing any knowledge. When this situation arises, it shows that one is lacking the necessary dhammoja, one is lacking the Dhamma nutrition, one is deficient of spiritual nutrition. So there will be abhavita kaya when one cannot restrain one's senses. As a yogi, if one does not have restraint of the senses, it is impossible for the yogi to make progress. If the yogi lacks restraint, the person will not be progressing, and thus the bodily conduct will not be developed, and the person also fails to practice moral conduct if there is no control. And also the mind will not be controlled. There will not be any control. There will not be any prevention or cure away from the nivranas. So in this way, the person will also fail to prevent nivrana hindrances from arising, and the person cannot cure these hindrances. And thus, one will not be uprooting these defilements. As the person fails to develop Vipassana Jhana, insight knowledge, one will not be developing Magga Jhana, path knowledge. So failing to have any control of the mind, when the person lacks mindfulness, there will be unwholesomeness, and thus the person's body, speech and mind will be inferior and degraded. His or her bad volition will also lead the person into lower existences. So that's why Buddha taught by using the word abhavita kaya. So if the person does not have any restraint of the senses, such as the eye and so on, the person will have greed, love, based on objects that are desirable, and the person will develop anger, aversion, based on objects that are undesirable. Lacking Satipatthana practice, one will be abhavita kaya. By practicing Satipatthana meditation, instead of abhavita kaya, there will be bhavita kaya. One bodily action will be developed, cultivated, and also there will be bhavita sila, as one develops sila, morality. There will be bhavita citta, as the mind is developed, cultivated by the practice of Satipatthana, and also there will be bhavita panya, there will be development of knowledge. So one should not leave one's physical, verbal, mental behavior uncontrolled. If one leaves one body, speech and mind uncontrolled, there can be avijja, covetousness, wanting to take other people's belongings by force, and thus the mind will be inferior and degraded. Having mindfulness, there will be anapija. One does not want to take other people's belongings by force unlawfully, but instead one wants to help others with metta and karuna, loving kindness and compassion. Having satipatthana practice, there will not be delusion. One discerns correctly, and as one develops viriya, effort, one will have courageous effort. One will have the courage to refrain from things that should be refrained from. One will have the courage to perform things that should be performed. Having viriya, effort in the practice, one will also develop sati and samadhi, mindfulness and concentration. When viriya, sati and samadhi, when effort, mindfulness and concentration become strengthened, one will realize that one is not the same as before. One will see one's improvement. So in this way, one will also have faith and confidence in the practice, seeing the benefits of practice. So in this way, one builds up faith and confidence in the Dhamma. One also develops faith and confidence in the Buddha who guided the way, and one also develops faith and confidence in the one who reaches purity through the practice of satipatthana. In this way, one also develops more courageous effort, having the courage to refrain from unwholesome deeds, having the courage to perform wholesome deeds, and thus one develops the spiritual strength that are strong, and one will be satisfied with oneself. If one does not have any control, if one does not develop, if one does not have restraint of the senses, then one's life will be undeveloped. If one's life is undeveloped, there will be bad consequences. There will be much of bad consequences. So if one just leaves one's life uncontrolled, there will be paṇḍitā. Paṇḍitā is translated as forgetfulness, negligence, failure. If one leaves one's life uncontrolled, then there will be duccirita, misconduct. One is morally degraded, and one is also insulting others. Not controlling oneself, one easily insults others. Not having metta and karuna, not having loving kindness and compassion, one insults others, one harms others by killing, stealing, committing sexual misconduct, lying, and so on. One fails to protect others from being hurt, and thus one also fails to control oneself. So in this way, one is negligent to refrain from misconduct, and thus the person is failing the responsibility as a human being, and the person fails to refrain from things that should be refrained from. Some people have the idea that the human life is very short, so they have the idea that one should have fun while having the human life, which is very short. So having this idea, they leave themselves, they leave their bodily behavior, verbal behavior uncontrolled. So if it is extreme, it will be very bad. Sayadaw gives an example. When traveling on a journey, one should keep on driving correctly according to the traffic regulations. One should stick to one's correct lane so that one will not be hurting others. In the same way, one should control one's bodily, verbal behavior. One should also control one's mind. Failing to have control of one's bodily behavior, verbal behavior and mental behavior, one is said to be failing to perform, failing to refrain from things that should be refrained from. So if one is leaving one's body, speech and mind uncontrolled, without shaping, without reforming, then his or her life will be like zero, with no control whatsoever. So if one is so used to having bad habits, not having any control at all, it will be difficult to reform. Not having any restraint of one's senses, not having any morality. Even if one has the control of one's senses, even if one has the morality, but when one coming into practice, if one is not practicing respectfully, meticulously, she will be negligent. The person will be negligent to refrain from things that should be refrained from. The person will be negligent to perform things that should be performed, and thus there will be paṇḍitā, failure, negligence, heedlessness. The opposite of paṇḍitā is apamāda. Apamāda means living, not parting with mindfulness. Having apamāda, one refrains from things that should be refrained from, one performs things that should be performed. If there is paṇḍitā, negligence, failure, one's life will be uncontrolled, unreformed, unshaped. So in order to reform oneself, in order to shape up one's life, one should have restraint of the senses, one should have apamāda, vigilance. One should have mindfulness, vigilance. Having mindfulness, one can abandon gross form of defilements. When one is practicing, one should have mindfulness so that one can overcome defilements. The mind should be directed in noting the object so that the mind will not go to sensual objects. In order to do so, one should be noting continuously every single second without any gaps in between. When the notings are continuous without gaps in between, then one is protecting, blocking the mind away from defilements, and one can see progress, improvement in oneself by practicing that way. And one will also realize that there is great improvement. It is like a new life in this very life. And Sayadaw has been teaching according to the teaching of the Buddha. Hearing this, yogi will get confused, as the yogis are asked to control their senses, as the yogis are asked to have restraint on their senses, to have restraint on eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and the mind. And yogis are advised to control their physical behavior, verbal behavior, to refrain from things that should be refrained from. So, hearing this, yogi will think that there are many things that they should do, and they may get confused. In order to ease such confusion, there should be Jhana. During the Buddha's time, a person came into the order to ordinate as a monk. Two of his teachers were giving guidance to the monk, saying, you should refrain from such kind of mental activities. You should refrain from doing this and that. You should refrain from doing this. It will be breaking the Vinaya. It will be an offense if you do this, if you do that. So, two of his teachers were explaining him do's and don'ts. And the new monk got discouraged, and he even wanted to disrobe. He wanted to leave the monkhood. So when this new monk saw Buddha, he told the truth that he is feeling discouraged, as there are so many things that he should refrain from, so many things to practice accordingly. So Buddha comforted this new monk, saying that I will ask you to control just one thing. So Buddha asked the new monk to control just one thing. The one thing that the new monk should control is the mind. And Buddha gave him the way to control the mind. Buddha gave the method of mindfulness to control the mind. So Sayadaw explains about Jhana. Jhana means observing closely, completely on the object of meditation. So in Pali it is said, Jayati upanejayati jhana. Jhana means contemplation, contemplating closely, completely on the object of meditation. There are two kinds of jhana. The first one is samatha jhana, and this samatha jhana is mentioned in the text as aramanupa nijjhana. The second one is lekhanupa nijjhana. Aramanupa nijjhana, the first one is samatha jhana. When one practices tranquility practice, they observe on the earth as the meditation object, or the water as the meditation object, and some of them may practice metta, loving kindness, as their meditation object, and some may contemplate on karuna. When they attain absorption, jhana, their mind will be away from hindrances such as kama chanda and jabhata. The mind will not be agitated, but the mind will be calm and tranquil. So this first type of jhana is called samatha jhana. What the yogis are practicing now is Vipassana jhana. So yogis are contemplating, observing the nama rupa, the mentality and materiality. So yogis are observing the physical and mental phenomena which are arising as cause and effect. Observing, noting the presently arising object, observing the physical and mental phenomena, one comes to discern the true nature, the characteristics of nama and rupa, and one develops knowledge stage by stage. Contemplating on the physical and mental phenomena is lakhanupa nijjhana, and to call it simply, it is Vipassana jhana. Observing closely, completely on the object of meditation is called jhana, and it is of two categories. The first one is samatha jhana, contemplating on the single object as meditation device, and the other one is Vipassana jhana, observing the nama rupa so that one discerns the true nature, the characteristics of nama and rupa. And Saraji will continue to explain the next day. Sadhu, 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 sadhu,